Most people have one particular game that made such an impact that it pretty much sold their souls in the world of gaming there and then. For me, that game was Flimbo's Quest. This was the very first game to totally capture my imagination in 1991, and it was pretty much the very first game that I ever played too when it came bundled in on a 4-game cartridge with my first ever computer, the Commodore 64. The package variant that I had was known as the Playful Intelligence Pack. The other 3 games bundled in was Fiendish Freddy's Big Top of Fun, International Soccer, and a fairly good arcade port of Clax. Of course, I had plenty more games on cassette that Christmas, but Flimbo's Quest, which released by System 3, was the game that I would constantly come back to over the years. Flimbo also released on C64 on cassette and disc, but never actually had a standalone cartridge as such. It only featured on the C64 GS cartridge, which was also bundled with the failed C64 GS console upon its release. So what was it that captivated me and pulled me into this strange platforming world with this game? It could well have been excellently produced music by one of its team's developers who went by the name of Boys About Brains, or it could have been the actual game itself, a straight to the point run and gun style platformer which had awesome colours and amazing parallax scrolling. It was likely a combination of everything though. What this was though, and especially for the Commodore 64 version, was a fairly tough game, especially once arriving at level 4 and onwards. Flimbo's quest is set around rescuing the Queen of Dewdrop Land. A mad scientist known as Franz Dandruff has kidnapped her. It's all fairly sinister really. Dandruff has created a machine which sucks the life out of people in order to extend his own life. And it's of course up to our cute little hero Flimbo to rescue Queen Pearly from his clutches. We platform through a total of 7 stages, which like I said most certainly gets tough from stage 4 onwards. We travel through various different stages, each comprising a different background throughout the game, including the first iconic stage, a random alien world is another, and it gets a little darker once we arrive at the graveyard stage later in the game. The premise is fairly simple. We are armed with a basic shooter, and the idea is to free roam the stages looking for scrolls, which are then in turn given to a wizard known as Daz. For those old school British TV fans out there, then no, this is nothing to do with Daz Doorstep Challenge with Shane Ritchie.
How confident are you in your whites? The Daz Doorstep Challenge is here in Leicester, so find out. How are you?
Oh, no!
This is Daz Bazian. By collecting scrolls and finding this wizard will allow the player to move on to the next stage, and each stage actually has a quota of scrolls to collect. It's not as simple as scrolls randomly appearing though. In the centre of the game's HUD is a box which displays an enemy character. It's this enemy character that has the scroll in the game. Now, since there are many of the same sprite in the game, the ones that lights up and flashes are the ones that has the scrolls. During our quest, we can also pop in to see Daz in order to power up our shooter, as well as buy items such as abilities to give the shooter a longer range of fire. We can buy level skips and other things such as invincibility. All of this comes at a cost though, but we can find the money throughout the stages. You'll most definitely need to use the wizard for upgrades though at some point, as like I said, damn, this game gets difficult. Something else to look out for is hearts. Sometimes when shooting enemies down, a red heart will fly out with them. Shoot at these to make it change colour and give a colour of each to the wizard to get an extra life. Each level also has a hidden ability. For example, on stage 2, by jumping onto a platform below a long bridge, press down and fire to gain a limited period of invincibility. Flimbo's Quest was released on a few different computer platforms in 1990 originally, which was the Amstrad CPC, the Commodore Amiga, and Atari ST. Obviously, my much more preferred version is the C64 version, and in hindsight this is an absolutely impressive release with its use of parallax scrolling alone. Both of the 16-bit computer versions are a little strange to play, as if like myself you grew up with the Commodore 64 version, well, the 16-bit versions have the in-game music back to front. For example, the C64 had this for stage 1, whereas the Amiga had this for stage 1. Of course, the 16-bit versions were that much nicer looking, but as I said, I am sure this game, for me anyways, is just pure nostalgia. I once investigated the possibilities of Flimbo's Quest 2 being made by the original Boys About Brains team. I did manage to get hold of one of them, and he did actually explain at the time that a mobile phone version was partially being planned, but due to lack of sales of their most current game at the time, their time and effort was potentially going to waste, as the boys was predominantly in it for financial gain. However, originally and back in the early 90s, there was a sequel planned, and in fact, if you head over to the Games That Weren't 64 website, you can download the Commodore 64 assets pack from there and learn more about it in that article. But by the seams of things though, System 3 screwed over the boys financially, and hence why a sequel never materialised at the time. Going back though to my own communication with the developers, well, they were awesome enough to send me some JPEG images of the initial sketches of what the modern day Flimbo sequel was going to be like. If you look up Lemon 64, that Commodore 64 age-old forum, and search for Flimbo's Quest 2, you'll likely find my original post from around 13 years back where I was talking about kickstarting a sequel. And talking about unfinished Flimbo's Quest games, there was actually an Atari XL and XE homebrew port in the works a few years back, but to my knowledge it was never actually finished. But still, the first level is somewhat playable and worth checking out if you're interested. And to go even further back with an unreleased original era version, it is said that the ZX Spectrum originally had a finalised version of the game, but was never released and it's never been uploaded online either, sadly. Flimbo's Quest to me is the ultimate Commodore 64 platformer, and it means a lot to me. So much so, I actually have a Flimbo tattooed on my arm. And during my days of being featured in Retro Gamer magazine with my son and publishing some C64 games, I went under the name of Flimsoft. See what I did there? And that wraps up another one of my personal favourite games today. Was you a big fan of Flimbo's Quest back in the day, or do you consider it just to be a mediocre platforming game for 8-bit and 16-bit computers? Anyways, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay retro.